Are you frustrated with messy data, clunky workflows, or perhaps just missing data overall? Now, I had a client who actually had subscription payments coming into Segment properly, but they were coming in multiple currencies, Canadian, UK, USD, and they wanted to normalize all this revenue into USD so it's easier to report on. Now, we could have asked the developer to do this for us, but that might have taken weeks. Instead, in a couple hours, and actually really just minutes, we can actually build a function, test it, and do this ourselves. So in this video, I want to show you how functions can help you supercharge your segment.com data. Let's jump right in. Now let's start with the insert function. This function is added to any existing destination. In this case, the destination is amplitude, and it can modify the event payload before it is sent to amplitude. So it's inserted in between segment and amplitude. And of course, you can insert it typically to almost any destination. Now, I'm going to show you here on my screen. In segment, under connections and then catalog, or you of course have sources, destinations, and then you have functions. Now I already built them here, so I can show you what they look like. So we're going to open the insert function here. And as you remember, the goal here is really to normalize revenue that's coming into multiple currencies into USD. Now, the way function works is it's just pretty vanilla JavaScript, so it's quite nice. And you have different functions, and they fire dependent on the payload of segments. So you can have this will fire on track calls down here. This will fire on identified calls, this on group calls, and on page calls, and so forth. Now, in the function itself, and if you are not familiar with JavaScript, then maybe a little ChatGPT can help you do this. But of course, remember that you're modifying data here, so you want to be able to test that properly. Now, in the function itself, we're going to pass on two things. We're going to pass on the event itself. This will be the event that's flowing through segment before it goes to the destination. And we pass on settings. Now, settings are helpful if you want to store anything like API keys or tokens. You can make them sensitive or not. So in here, I just have one thing, which is an API key. You don't need to use this, of course. For our example here, we have to pull the exchange rates from somewhere. So in this case, I'm using this exchange rate called exchangeratesAPI.io. No affiliation. It's just a service that simply gives you exchange rates in an API call. We pass on the access key down here as a variable, and then this is the sort of the endpoint itself. Then we have some logic just to, we're going to call the endpoint. We're going to have some code here in case there's some errors, though unlikely there'll be errors. If there are errors, then we're simply just going to throw an error. We're not going to do anything. Once we're ready, then we're going to get the exchange rates into this variable called exchange rates. And this is actually just a simple JSON object. Let me see if I can show you that here. It actually just looks like this. So when you call the API, you simply get a bunch of rates with the currency on the left side and then the rate itself. And this is most likely the latest data here. So very simple. This is what the segment function is receiving. So we put it into a variable, and then we have some logic here just to make this work. So we're going to check if the USD exchange rate is there. Again, unlikely it will not be there, but just in case. And then we're going to take some stuff from the event itself. Now let me show you the event payload here. I have anonymized it here, but you can see what it looks like. So all the event payloads in Segment typically follow this format, right? We have properties for the different event properties. We have other things like the message ID. We have the context. We may have traits. We may have a user ID and so forth, right? Again, this is sort of like a real payload that just been anonymized in terms of the values. So we go back to our function. So now we're going to look for a few things. We're going to make sure that this track call has properties, and they have the revenue property, and they have the currency property. So down here, we have revenue and we have currency. You can see this is actually coming in Canadian. So we need those two things to kind of make this work. We're going to set the currency into a variable. Here we're logging things. Actually, this is optional, but if you're testing things, it's very handy, of course, to be logging things to the console as we go along. Actually, I'll keep it there because I want to show you what that looks like. And then we have a quick function that's going to take our currency, in this case Canadian. It's going to go look for it in that exchange rate JSON array that we saw before. It's going to get the value, and then it's going to convert it. And then it's going to add it as a new property. It's going to be called revenue_USD. Now, once you're done with the function, then the main thing you have to do is you have to return the event. And that way the event is able to continue on to the destination itself. And you see we have a bunch of console logs here just from my testing here. So once you have a function, you can actually run it here, right? It's gonna run whatever's here in the payload. So it runs it, and down here it gives you some kind of output, success or failure. And because we have console logs all over the place, we can see those, right? So we're logging the currency itself. It's Canadian, good job. We're logging the USD rate. That's the rate right now. And then we log the event itself, the one that's been just before its return. And we can see that now there's a new property called revenue_USD. And this is successful. So this is basically how functions work. We have modified the payload. We have done some kind of logic. You can see because it's plain JavaScript, you can do a lot of things here. Of course, you can pull in whatever APIs you need or whatever kind of logic you want to do. We modify it, and then we pass on the modified payload. In this case, simply modify by adding a new, and that's the end of the function, right? You save it, you deploy it if you want to make it live, and then you add it to whatever destination where you want this to run and change. So very handy, very powerful. And again, once you get familiar with this, you can get this up and running 20, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, test it and stage it, deploy it to production, much quicker than having this done by a developer where it might take maybe a couple of weeks to go through a sprint. So that's really the power to, especially if you want to make some of this, whether it's kind of smaller, minor modifications to your data payload, and where perhaps you don't necessarily need a developer to do it because you can kind of do everything yourself in the way I did it here. Now this is one form of functions. Now I want to show you a second form, functions as destinations. So let's go back to our catalog. We're going to open this request bin function. You can see this is a destination function. The function here is still very similar. We're still going to be firing on the track call. In this case, though, we're going to be sending data to some kind of URL, right? In this case, this almost functions like a webhook. So you need some kind of API that can receive the JSON object that we want to send, the payload that we saw before, and then that service will do something with that JSON object. So we have our URL here. This is a request bin, just a simple service that can allow the catching of webhooks effectively. Very similar logic here. We have our request bin, or our endpoint URL, and then we're going to build the call itself. It's going to be a post, a content type application JSON. We're going to stringify the JSON payload that we saw before. If there's an error in sending it, we're going to throw the error. Otherwise, we're going to just simply log that this event has been successfully sent to request bin. So let's see what this looks like. As always, we have our sample payload here. So let's just simply run this, see what this looks like. No access here, of course, here. We're just sending data to an endpoint. You, of course, could add some kind of token authentication if you really wanted to maintain this a little bit more secure. That's your choice. So we see the event was successfully sent to request bin. So let's open request bin to see what it looks like. And we see the post call from today. We open it, and the entire sort of payload that we saw before is here. So again, very simple. It just simply received a post webhook. But this also means that through a very simple function, you can then really connect to any service out there that has an API. It may not be supported by Segment. Segment supports right now something like 400 plus destinations. But if you so happen to have one that's not supported, but it still has an API, you can do this. And of course, you may write some code to modify the payload to ensure that the names of the event properties, or even just the JSON itself, is structured in the way that the service is expecting the data to be properly ingested. So once again, this becomes a very, very handy way to send data to a bunch of other destinations in just a few lines of code. Finally, the third type of function are source functions. So let me show you what those look like. We're back at our catalog here, and we have our existing source function I wrote just for this video. We open it. This one is a little bit different, right? We don't have track calls. We don't have identify calls here. Instead, we just have a request. So we get the on request, then we have the request and perhaps some settings. If we have any, we can do the same thing as before. Now, Segment has created an API here you can test, or where the data will be sent. There is some authentication you'll need to do based on your account, your user login, to create the token necessary to authenticate this. But effectively, Segment will be receiving webhooks from your service with some kind of JSON object that you can then modify in different ways. Now, I'm not going to send a webhook. Instead, I'm just going to copy and paste the same payload that we have been working with so far. We know, of course, that when this payload comes in, it will have some kind of headers, maybe some kind of authentication that we can validate. And then we have a bunch of data here in the JSON object. And here on the left, then once a request comes in and is successful, then we have the ability to fire Segment events. Now, if you work with any of the SDKs so far, like the Analytics SDK or the iOS, Android, you'll likely recognize some of these things. We're effectively just firing track calls or identify calls or group calls. So if you look at the track call, once a request comes in, we can then fire an event. We're going to call it subscription payment. We're actually doing this manually, though. Of course, we could just go get the event name from the payload itself if we wanted to. We're going to go get the user ID from the event itself, body.user ID, and then we're going to get the properties from the properties object, so body.properties, right? And the sort of the rest of the payload we are discarding in this case. But of course, we can use it as much as we want. Then we can do the same for an identify. We could do the same for a group or a page or a screen or a set. Effectively, you can take bits and pieces from the request that came in and then pass it into just a regular track call, identify call, and so forth. So once again, if we run this, we'll see that the output was successful and Segment did fire events. In this case, it'll fire an event called subscription payment. We open that and we can see that it took the user ID from the payload itself and it took all the properties from the payload and passed them as event properties. Then the identify was passed on, but we're not doing anything with this. So this again also lets you interact with services that may be able to generate webhooks, which is pretty common these days. And then you're able to catch that webhook through an endpoint that Segment provides, do some kind of authentication if you so want to, and then you can take that webhook, modify it, tweak it, take what you need, and then fire events into Segment itself. This event here that we just fired called subscription payment will then flow into other destinations. So this function becomes a source, just like you may have a JavaScript source or an iOS source or an Android source, and then you can connect the 400 plus destinations I mentioned earlier to this, and then they'll receive the whatever event that you're firing through or from the source. You of course want to make sure all the relevant event properties, and in fact all these special properties are there. If we were firing this into Amplitude, we will want to double check that we are firing perhaps the specific user agent or the device information or the traits and so forth. And we can do this all within the track call. It's just a matter of finding the right way to structure this call and get the right pieces from it. So those are the three types of functions in Segment: inserts, destinations, and sources. They all function very similarly, right? You have a little bit of JavaScript code that either catches data or sends data, but they make the transformation of the data and the connection to hundreds and thousands of services much easier. It's really one of my favorite functionality that Segment offers because it just really opens the possibilities of what you can do with your Segment data. And finally, if you're looking for your next video to watch, I highly recommend you check out this 45-minute video I made on segment.com. If you feel like something's missing in your Segment data, whether it might be client versus backend data, pricing, or anything else, this video will help you understand everything you need to know about Segment and how to make the most out of your Segment data. It'll be right here. Until next time, we'll talk soon.